Hey everybody, I'm back with a part 2 to my last video where I tested 4 primary exotic weapons in Destiny just to determine which you'd get the most value out of if you needed it for emergency backup DPS. And today I'm going to test some of the exotics that y'all asked for in the comments, but first I just want to clarify a couple things from my last video. First, I misspoke when I said that Hierarchy of Needs gets its full damage bonus at 30 meters. It's actually 40 meters, and I had that in my script and notes from the testing on the last one, but I guess I accidentally said 30 meters, and I didn't catch that when I watched back through the video before uploading it. Sorry about that, but I will say that the Hierarchy of Needs testing that I did for the last video was at about a 45 meter range, so the DPS values presented there were accurate, but the distance that I said was not. I put that in the pinned comment on that last video as well, but I just want to go ahead and mention it here too. Again, sorry about that. It's my fault. Don't have a chance to really re-edit that and upload it, but hopefully I won't have that mistake happen again. And second, I also forgot to mention exactly what bosses I tested that on, so I'll just mention that I used the Nessus Lost Sector boss, as well as Avarok the Covetous and Grasp of Avarice. The damage values that I got on both those bosses were identical, because there's no need for any kind of damage modifiers against them. And I believe I also mentioned it in the last video, but I did not test with Well of Radiance or Divinity or any other damage buffs other than what was on the exotics I tested. Anyway, I tested a lot of what y'all suggested, and I tested almost all of them here versus Avarok for long-term damage phases, and then against the Nessus Lost Sector boss for DPS, and Avarok as well for burst DPS. And unlike the last video where I did use no damage buffs or debuffs, I did use a Well of Radiance and a Divinity for the Avarok tests, because it made hitting crits much easier, and for some of these I couldn't just get the one-shot damage value and calculate based on fire rate. There was a little more going on, so I needed more practical data. I was going to do a full retest of Touch of Malice, Hierarchy of Needs, Revision 0, and Outbreak Perfected with Well and Div, but the damage numbers I did for those 4 were still a lot higher than some of the others, even without a Divinity or Well. I did, however, using the buff and debuff numbers from Well and Divinity, calculate how much Touch of Malice, Hierarchy of Needs, Revision 0, and Outbreak Perfected would deal with a 15% debuff like Divinity, and a 25% buff like Well or Weapons of Light, and those values are going to be on your screen right now, just so the values from last video can be made consistent with the test conditions for this one. The ones in last video are a little lower because, again, there was no Divinity and no Well. And for the exotics in this video, I also tested them with exotic armor and reload mods that could potentially boost the DPS, which I did not do for the 4 exotics from my last video. The results still didn't beat any of the 4 exotics from the previous video for most of the long-term DPS, but some of them did give themselves real potential for use in a burst DPS situation, although most of them were dependent on a class, because that was another thing for the last video is I didn't use any exotic armor because that's exclusive to classes, so like no Actium War Rig for Titans, no Lucky Pants for Hunters, etc. And a lot of the exotic primaries here that found themselves being held back were held back by the fact they just needed to constantly reload, which hurts their DPS values very significantly. I found that Touch of Malice and Hierarchy of Needs are so strong because they never really have to reload, and that was a big reason why they do so much DPS. But infinite ammo does not necessarily make for good DPS, as we'll see in a minute. And some of these, on the other hand, were very strong for burst damage, giving you a huge chunk of damage before falling off due to losing access to a buff they needed. The strongest burst exotics were Quicksilver Storm, Malfeasance, and Hawkmoon. I had Quicksilver, which was about equal to Revision, although I would probably put Revision a little higher because of high precision, don't need to worry about the grenades missing, and not necessarily needing the barrier mod in every encounter, but the intrinsic barrier is really nice, whereas Quicksilver Storm does not have that. And then the other 2 very strong burst exotics were Malfeasance and Hawkmoon on Hunters using Lucky Pants. Let's start by looking at other exotics that have infinite ammo perks, like No Time to Explain and Polaris Lance, which were suggested, I believe, because of their infinite ammo perks, and in a long DPS phase versus Avarok, they did really low damage. Polaris Lance had 11,598 damage per second, and No Time to Explain actually did even less. It only did 10,414 damage per second. Those were both significantly lower than even the Divinity that my friend was using to buff my damage, and honestly, neither of these I would say are viable for boss damage, even if you're completely out of ammo for your special and heavy. I feel like you could probably match this with some legendary weapons, and I honestly blame it on their low fire rate. Low fire rate exotics are typically worse for doing DPS, which is just a trend you see on just about everything, and I believe that it's because both No Time to Explain and Polaris Lance are the lowest fire rate of their weapon types. That's why this happened. I would say just stick with Touch of Malice if you're going to use something with infinite ammo, or even Hierarchy of Needs if you need an infinite ammo option. Polaris and No Time, very, very weak. Up in the next tier, I tested some auto rifles with the Titan Exotic Chest Piece Actium War Rig. I started with Quicksilver Storm because that was widely requested, and it did about 14,876 damage per second while I was just laying into the boss, not swapping over to the grenades because I wanted to test that separately. And with swapping to the grenades, I was able to do a little more. I got up to 15,329 DPS. Now, Quicksilver Storm does still work with the animation cancel technique for the grenade launcher and the reload. This basically just lets you skip the manual auto rifle reload animation after you fire your 3 grenades if you tap the reload button really quickly before you fire. And if you manage to pull this off, you'll also be able to speed up the pump action animation for the grenade launcher. So, if you're able to get this done reliably, Quicksilver Storm will do around 35,134 DPS, which is actually really solid. It'll take a bit of practice to get this down, but if you can, it's pretty good. A bit less damage than some of the other options, but super solid regardless, especially considering Quicksilver Storm is a really solid primary weapon, and you'll be able to get good boss damage out of it at the same time. Now, the other thing to think about is how you're going to want to use it. So essentially, you're going to want to fire your grenades while doing the pump action animation cancel, then fire about half a magazine because you can't do this animation cancel with a full magazine, and you need to hit rockets to recharge your grenades, switch back to your grenades, repeat, rinse, repeat. Do that over and over again, and you'll still keep really solid damage output with this auto rifle. If you're able to skip that reload animation, then it's probably still going to be very good, especially considering it's going to get its catalyst in Lightfall that it does not currently have. However, this thing is going to be really strong in a rotation, even without the animation cancel, because you can use the grenades to get some damage to activate your bait and switch Cataclysmic that you're probably using against whatever raid boss you're fighting. And that's super strong, because it's going to be a lot stronger than just tapping it once or twice with your really low auto rifle damage. But I would say, personally, I would skip this as a backup option for DPS when other options like Touch of Malice have far greater ease of use. As an initial burst damage option, however, you can probably get away with this because you get about 44,430 DPS into a total of 146,619 while using your grenades to activate your bait and switch. The other 2 auto rifles that I tested were Sweet Business and Tommy's Matchbook, both still with Actium War Rig equipped. Sweet Business got 18,836 DPS, and Tommy's Matchbook got 20,163 with a constant overheat, staying in a well to keep myself from dying to the overheat. Although Tommy's Matchbook cannot kill you like Touch of Malice, it can get you low enough that you might get one shot by stray enemies here or there. Neither of these were super great, but they weren't ever really meant to do DPS in the current meta anyway. I personally really like Tommy's Matchbook. I think it's a lot of fun, but again, I would not personally use this as a backup DPS. After that, I tested the 2 SMGs that y'all had requested. I tested Osteo Striga, for which I had a teammate use Touch of Malice's Blight Shot to give it the 50% buff, since it is a weapon of sorrow. And going into that damage phase, I started with a 107 round overflow in my magazine, and was able to stretch that out to about 22,819 DPS. The main issue that I had was that Osteo Striga has such a low fire rate that it hurts its DPS potential, and while the poison is super strong for killing normal enemies as it spreads out in a wide area and gains the extra 40% damage that exotic primaries have against minor enemies, it does not, however, do very good damage to single targets like the bosses. That was my only issue with it. It's still incredibly strong for fighting bosses and adds alike. I wouldn't use it as a personal backup since I have Touch of Malice, Hierarchy of Needs, Revision 0. I have other options, but again, it's not the worst thing you could use. Tarrabah, on the other hand, impressed me wildly. I knew that it was pretty good, and I didn't know it was this good. Tarrabah in 1 DPS phase versus Avarok was able to keep Ravenous Beast from ever falling below 6 seconds remaining, and I think this was because the dregs on the sides shoot and throw grenades into the well, and that was keeping me stacked up. I'm not 100% sure. I know Ravenous Beast also extends on damage dealt. I don't know if it does on damage received. I haven't used Tarrabah a ton. However, I was able to keep up a consistent 31,343 DPS, totaling almost 1 million damage in the entire damage phase, which lasts just below 30 seconds. And the big thing here is because Tarrabah's Solar, it can get Font of Might, which will make it even stronger. If you were to use it, you are going to need to be pretty close to the boss, just so you don't have any range fall off, reducing your damage. And I would say to have Ravenous Beast ready when the DPS phase starts, but you could definitely use this in a pinch if you needed to. I think this is incredibly strong, all things considered. And lastly, let's look at the two hand cannons that I saw requested in the comments. I tested both of them. They were Hawkmoon and Malfeasance. And I tested both with and without Lucky Pants, but I'm just going to put the Lucky Pants numbers here because those were significantly better than the numbers without Lucky Pants, to the point that unless you are a Lucky Pants hunter, I will recommend skipping both Malfeasance and Hawkmoon. But starting with Hawkmoon, it's very important to note that Lucky Pants does not buff the final shot in the magazine. If it did, Hawkmoon would be insanely overpowered, but unfortunately, Bungie has Lucky Pants specifically tuned to prevent that from happening. Over a longer duration, Hawkmoon with Lucky Pants was able to put out around 24,857 DPS, but that isn't really where Hawkmoon shines. It, like several of the other exotics, is best used as a burst damage option. In one magazine, you can fire all 8 shots buffed by Lucky Pants, and then your 9th paracausal shot, which will not be buffed, but it will still hit for around 90,000 damage. The total DPS that this had was 54,708 damage per second in a 3.8 second window, for a total of 211,173 damage. And unfortunately, that 54,000 DPS value is only sustainable for one magazine, because when Lucky Pants hits its cooldown for 10 seconds, you're just going to be doing normal damage, which is not nearly as strong. However, if you use a bait and switch Cataclysmic, bait and switch has a duration of 10 seconds. Lucky Pants also has a cooldown of 10 seconds, so you can use the Hawkmoon to do burst damage and then switch to your Cataclysmic, use your DPS for that 10 seconds, of course having to switch to your special somewhere in there to get the full 3 weapons hit for bait and switch. So while it's not great as a backup option, you can weave it into your bait and switch rotation, and that will help your ammo economy because you're using more primary ammo for more damage, and that will then therefore reduce the chance that in a hypothetical like contest or master raid scenario that you'll need the backup option as badly. So being able to improve ammo economy with it is actually really, really good, as long as you're able to weave it into something like a bait and switch rotation. Even stronger when paired with Lucky Pants, however, was Malfeasance. Malfeasance has several things going for it. It has a very high fire rate, it has bonus damage against taken enemies, and it has a very large magazine. What a lot of people don't necessarily know about Malfeasance is that targets blighted by Witherhoard are considered taken for the purposes of that damage bonus. That, combined with the very fast fire rate for a hand cannon, essentially means that you're stacking your Lucky Pants extremely quickly, and you're getting more use out of the very short duration that it has once it hits 10 stacks. Again, over a full DPS phase, it wasn't too great, as Malfeasance's damage fell off pretty hard because of all the reloads needed, especially once Lucky Pants hit its cooldown, but again, like Hawkmoon, it is extremely good when you add it to a rotation, since it does really good damage and contributes to your ammo economy. If I fired all 20 rounds in one magazine with Malfeasance, with Lucky Pants equipped, against a Witherhoard blighted target, I got 545,290 damage in 6.67 seconds, which is a burst DPS value of 81,753, which is already super high on its own. However, there was one more thing that I really wanted to test here. You see, Lucky Pants would always lose its buff around 5 shots left in the magazine with Malfeasance, so I decided to try and see if stopping after 15 shots resulted in higher DPS, because even though firing all 20 is going to be slightly higher total, I'm losing the buff, so I'm curious if the time is used as efficiently. So what I did was I fired 15 shots, and I did 521,602 damage, and that's in 5 seconds of firing. That's a burst DPS of 104,320, which is ridiculously good for a primary weapon. Malfeasance is really, really strong, and I'd honestly recommend for any hunters using it in tandem with a special and a linear for max bait and switch damage. And similar to Hawkmoon, by the time your Lucky Pants is ready again, your Malfeasance will already have some more ammo without needing you to actually do a manual reload, since Lucky Pants has a built-in holster mod. The other thing is hunters, you might still be able to get more damage total out of using Star Eater scales for your super, whether that's Blade Barrage, a Tether, or the Arc Staff throw. I forget the name of it, but this could be good if you don't need to use your super for the boss. However, again, guys, that's about all the testing I was able to get in this weekend, so I'm really sorry if I didn't get a chance to test your suggestion, but I do really appreciate all the support on the last video, because it makes me really happy to see that y'all all like the math that I had to do for that. And as always, if you like what I do, a like and subscribe are always super appreciated, and if there's something I can do better, please let me know in the comments down below, and I'll be happy to try and improve on the next video. Catch y'all next time.